This is a 2014 Volkswagen XL-1. Although you might be surprised to hear that this is 7 years old. It looks like it's from the future. And how about this? It gets 260 miles per gallon. It also costs around $150,000. And well, just look at it. This is the world's only economy car that's also a supercar. This thing is very bizarre, and today I'm going to review it. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era. We've had some great sales recently on Cars and Bids, including this 2011 BMW 1 Series M, which sold for over $52,000, one of my very favorite modern cars. Also, this Porsche Boxster RS60 sold for $32,000, and this glorious Tesla Roadster brought $97,500. We love cool, special, interesting modern cars on Cars and Bids, and if you're looking to sell one, Cars and Bids is the place. And if you're looking to buy a cool car from the modern era, we have daily auctions and great selection at carsandbids.com. I've borrowed this XL-1 from the Lane Motor Museum, which is an automotive museum here in Nashville, Tennessee, that is truly fantastic with some amazing cars, including this XL-1 and many, many others. I highly recommend, if you are in the Nashville area and you're interested in cars at all, check out the Lane Motor Museum. You will see an incredible collection with some fantastic cars. You can learn more about the Lane Motor Museum by clicking the link in the description of this video. So let's talk XL-1. This first came out as a concept car in the 2000s, and the goal was to get 100 kilometers on 1 liter of fuel, which works out to about 240 miles per gallon, which is insane. Now, it took Volkswagen forever to actually bring this car to market, almost 10 years. But when they finally did the production version, this car actually beat the goal. And like I said, this gets about 260 miles per gallon. Think about that. Of course, there's a lot of innovation required to get there. There's a diesel engine in this car, a 2-cylinder diesel that makes about 50 horsepower. There's also an electric motor for additional power and range, and a limited pure electric driving range. There's also a dual clutch automatic transmission and insanely aerodynamic styling, as you can see, and there's about a 2.5 gallon fuel tank, giving this car a total range of about 250 miles. But the market is limited for a car like this, actual consumers wanting to buy a car like this, and really it was just a technical exercise from Volkswagen to see if they could do it, and they did. Volkswagen built just 250 units of the XL-1, all for Europe, and they only sold 200 to retail buyers, priced from around $150,000. That's a lot of money, but when you were driving this car, it felt like you were driving the future, and today I'm going to review this car and see if it still feels like that. First, I'll take you on a tour of the XL-1 and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. There are many. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug's score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the XL-1 with getting inside, and that means starting with the key, which is just a normal Volkswagen folding key, like every other Volkswagen model from this era had. Same exact key for the bizarre XL-1. In fact, you will find throughout this video that this car is a bizarre mashup of normal, regular Volkswagen pieces and completely insane stuff you wouldn't expect to find on a Volkswagen from this era. For instance, once you unlock the door with this regular Volkswagen folding key, actually opening the door, you press this little panel here on the rear fender, the door pops, and then you open it upwards. This car has butterfly doors like a supercar. I told you this was the world's first and only economy car supercar, and the doors certainly prove that. You might have this key with your Jetta, but you don't have these doors. And next up, climbing into the XL-1, since I've shown you how to get in, how about how to get out? There is a little silver lever door handle mounted basically on the floor next to the seat. You pull that and then you kind of push the door open and it opens up, and that is how you climb out of your XL1. But the very first thing you undoubtedly notice when you climb inside this car is that the seats are not next to each other. You can see the driver's seat is further forward than the passenger seat, and that's not just because it's like moved a little further forward right now. The seats are actually offset. The passenger seat and the driver's seat are in different places in this car, and you can see the driver's side footwell goes a lot deeper than the passenger side footwell, which is further forward to correspond with the placement of the seats. This is very unusual. This seat placement absolutely bizarre. When the XL1 was first shown as a concept car, it had tandem seating, so one driver's seat in front and one passenger seat in back. When they actually made the production version, they wanted to put the seats next to each other because that's what a rational car would have, that people would actually want to buy, but I suspect for more room, they decided to offset the seats a little bit so the passenger has a little space and the driver has a little space, and they don't have to sit directly next to each other shoulder to shoulder. So you have offset seats in this car. Very strange. Probably the strangest part about this whole thing though, the passenger seat is fixed in place. So even if the passenger wants to move forward or backward, they can't. The driver's seat can move, but the passenger can't. The passenger has to stay a little bit behind the driver at all times. What a weird quirk. And next up we move on to the next rather odd quirk in this vehicle, and that would be the fact that there are no mirrors. None at all. No mirrors. For one thing, this car has no back window. You can see the teardrop shape back here to make it as aerodynamic as possible. It doesn't really lend itself to a back window, so there is none. So putting a central rear view mirror like at the top of the windshield, that would just be pointless, so they just didn't bother. But this car also has no side mirrors, no wing mirrors, and that too is for aerodynamic reasons. In order to make this car achieve the fuel economy target that Volkswagen wanted, they had to have everything working together to increase the fuel economy. So that meant the diesel engine had to be small and efficient, the electric motors had to help out, light weight had to be a component, and obviously aerodynamics as well was really important. And putting mirrors on the side of the car just screws with the aerodynamics, so they didn't want to do that. But if you look on the outside, you will notice these little panels coming off the car where the mirrors would be. They are cameras. If you look closely, you can see the little camera in there recording what's happening on this side of the car. Then it sends what it's seeing to these little screens in the door. You can see this one on the passenger side showing what a rear view mirror would be showing, and same deal over here on the driver's side. So those are your mirrors in this car, little mirror cameras, and that was done to improve aerodynamics. So you didn't have big mirrors sticking up on the outside of the car and screwing with the aero. Instead, just these tiny little panels that host cameras and then camera monitor screens inside. Pretty crazy. And by the way, on the subject of the mirrors, it's worth noting backing up in this car is absolutely terrifying because you can't see behind you. There's no mirror, there's no window, and all you have are the rear mirror cameras, which basically are just looking at the side. Now, when you shift into reverse, it's worth noting that the rear cameras kind of change their angle a little bit and show like a slightly wider angle, but it doesn't really help all that much. It doesn't show what's directly behind you. It does sort of a better job, but it's not that useful. Although the cameras also pop up a little R for reverse and a couple of lines to let you know you're in reverse. That is very useful. Thank you. I'm absolutely terrified when I'm backing up, but at least the mirror cameras say R on them. But anyway, since we're talking about these mirror cameras mounted on the door panels, let's talk about the other interesting door quirk, and that would be the windows. If you look at the door panels, you'll see there's no window switches. You can't roll down the windows. Oh no, you can. You just have to unfurl the window crank from this plastic circle. You pop it out, the crank appears, and then you crank the window down, and that's how you roll down the window in the XL1. And when you're done rolling it down, you can put the crank back in place to give yourself a little bit more room in your footwell, and then you can just pop it out the next time you want to crank the window down. An absolutely bizarre window crank, but again, they were going for lightweight everything in this car, and so apparently that meant ditching power windows. But anyway, next we move on to the rest of this interior, which, like I mentioned outside, is a bizarre grouping of normal Volkswagen stuff and really strange quirks. For instance, the gauge cluster just looks like a fairly normal Volkswagen gauge cluster from this era. Same deal with the turn signal stock and the windshield wiper stock. They look pretty standard, but then the steering wheel is carbon fiber flat bottom steering wheel. Looks like something you would see on a supercar. In fact, this car has a lot of carbon fiber, including a lot of the body is carbon fiber, which helped keep the weight down. This car weighs about 1,800 pounds, which is of course tremendously light. And again, that's another contributing factor to get the fantastic fuel economy that this car has. But you can also see some of that carbon fiber in the steering wheel. And by the way, speaking of the steering wheel, this car has manual steering. It doesn't have power steering. Heavy manual steering at low speeds, difficult to turn the wheel, but that's part of the weight savings that help keep this car's weight down. This car also has in the steering wheel, of course, a horn, which sounds tremendously pathetic, as you might expect from a car this little size. Take a listen to the XL1's horn. But anyway, next up we move into the center, and once again you can see some fairly normal Volkswagen controls in here. The climate controls just look like they could come out of any other relatively cheap Volkswagen from this era. Although, an oddity, a quirk in here is the volume control. Apparently there was no room for a volume knob, so instead they have individual buttons for volume up and volume down. You just have to tap each button to raise or lower the volume. Kind of strange, but that's just what they did. And by the way, speaking of the buttons in the center here, you can see one of them has an image of an exterior mirror and the word on underneath. I pressed that thinking maybe it turns on or off the mirror cameras, but actually it doesn't seem to do that, so I'm not precisely sure what this does, but probably a good thing. You can't turn on or off the mirrors in this car, and they're always on. Next up, another interesting quirk in here is the climate vent situation. Like I said, this car has climate controls. I showed you those. It has air conditioning, but it only has 2 climate vents. One over on the driver's side, as you can see, and one over on the passenger side, and that's it. You do have this big long vent through the center of the dashboard, but that's a dummy. It doesn't actually send any air through it. 2 climate vents, not really ideal, but this is a very small cabin. You probably only need 2 climate vents to heat it up or cool it down. And next up, another interesting quirk of this interior, no glove box. You can see the passenger side of the dashboard is just this carbon fiber panel. No glove box here, although you do have a net underneath the panel where you can stick stuff like registration papers, whatever, but that's all the glove box you get in this car. In fact, there's basically no storage in this interior. The only storage compartments are directly in front of the shift lever. You have this little lid that rolls back to reveal a small, thin compartment, and behind the driver's seat you have a storage compartment back here, reasonably large, but of course only one compartment since the passenger seat is mounted further back, so there's no room for a compartment on the passenger side. And by the way, speaking of that center storage compartment in the center console, you also have your shift lever here, which you can see again is just a fairly standard Volkswagen shift lever. This car has a dual clutch automatic transmission, I suspect for fuel economy reasons, and you just shift into gear like you'd shift any other Volkswagen model from this era, even though this is the bizarre XL1. And next up, speaking of the center of this interior, I draw your attention to the infotainment screen, which is actually just a Garmin GPS screen kind of tacked on there. It's mounted there from the factory. It's not like this car just has a Garmin unit in it, but it's pretty similar to just sticking on a Garmin. That's the infotainment system in this $150,000 car. But I will say they have personalized it a little for the XL1. For instance, on the main screen, the car section is a picture of an XL1, not just a generic car. Also, I love the fact that when a door is open, this screen shows an image of the XL1 from the top showing the door open, which door it is, and you can see that teardrop shape, and that is a pretty cool look. You actually get that same image shown in the gauge cluster. You can see here again the teardrop shape showing the door open, so both of those screens will show you which door you have open, but that is a pretty cool touch, actually depicting the XL1. Now, a couple of interesting things in this infotainment system. For one, you go into car info, and you can see exactly what system is like powering the car right now. If you're running on the diesel powered engine, or if you're running on electricity, or exactly how the systems are working, you can kind of monitor the energy flow while you're driving, which is pretty cool. Maybe more interesting is the fact that you can actually get the car to give you an efficiency score rating how your driving style is in terms of efficiency. So if you want to drive as efficiently as possible, you would keep this screen up, and then it would constantly update your score and let you know how you're doing in terms of your efficiency. And that is a pretty cool touch for a car that is designed to be as efficient as possible. But other than those rather interesting screens, the rest of this infotainment is pretty basic stuff. You just have your media, your stereo controls in here, your phone settings, and your navigation all on this main menu, and they're all pretty simple, easy to figure out. After all, this is just a Garmin unit, not really anything too exciting or too complicated to work with. By the way, one other item worth noting, underneath the passenger seat, there is a black bag that is like Velcroed in place with a few straps. It seems like it wouldn't be a factory placement for something, but it is, and that is the tire inflator kit situation. It's not placed in the cargo area, it is under the passenger seat in case you have a flat tire in your XL1 and you're looking for it. And next up we move on to the cargo area in the XL1, which interestingly enough is located back here. Now to access it, you can press the trunk opener button on the key fob, which unfortunately, as you can see, is just a generic car with its trunk open, not an image of the XL1. Or you can get here by unlocking the door, and then there's a little latch back here. You kind of push, and then you open the cargo area hatch, which the first thing you notice is this isn't just the cargo area, it also shares this space with the diesel-powered engine. Like I said, very small 2-cylinder diesel back here, so it can fit into this tiny space along with the cargo area. And the cargo area is actually pretty big back here. You can get some good-sized stuff into the back, which is nice. You have a relatively large cabin and a relatively large cargo area, given the tiny size of this car, which really does speak to this car's capabilities as a great commuter car. 2 relatively roomy seats and a decent cargo space. You can also see back here a lot of the carbon fiber construction in this car all around the cargo area, the engine, underneath the trunk panel that opens up. It's all carbon fiber, and again, a lot of carbon fiber construction used in this car to save weight. One other carbon fiber thing I like back here is that it actually says XL1 kind of imprinted into the carbon fiber in the cargo area, which is a neat little Easter egg you can see every time you open up your trunk. XL1, a reminder of your rather strange economy supercar. And next up, since we're back here, this angle gives you a great view of the aerodynamic shape of the XL1. This teardrop shape sloping down in the back, almost coming to a point in the back of this car, all for aerodynamic purposes to try to squeeze every possible last iota of fuel economy out of this vehicle. This aerodynamic shape, very, very distinctive to the XL1. You can even see this cover over the rear wheel. Since it doesn't have to turn, you don't really need it to be exposed, so you cover it for better aerodynamics. It doesn't necessarily look better, but it certainly provides a little bit better range, better fuel economy by doing that. And speaking of covering the wheels, worth noting that the front wheels obviously can't be covered because they have to turn in their wheel well, but Volkswagen has done the next best thing with these flat wheels. Completely flat, again for aerodynamic purposes. The only little hole in the wheel is to give you access to the valve stem cap to put air in the tire in case you have a flat. That's it. Otherwise, flat, aerodynamic. That's the theme on the outside of this car, and this particular angle is probably the best way to see that. And next up, since from the back of the XL1, I have to say the taillight design is fantastic and very futuristic. You can see with the taillights on, it's just a big light bar going across basically the entire rear of the car, kind of an upside down U shape, which looks pretty cool. When you put on the brake light, it's just sort of the end, sort of an inverted L or J shape at the very ends of the car to indicate that it's braking, which also looks cool. And same deal with the turn signal. It also has that same L or J shape like the brake light, except it lights up in orange. A very futuristic tail light look to this car, complementing a very futuristic overall design. And speaking of cool lighting, there's more up front, as you might imagine. For one thing, the turn signal on the side of the car is mounted on the mirror, but this car doesn't have a mirror, so it's mounted on that little panel with the mirror camera, which is kind of a cool touch. So many cars have side mirror mounted turn signals. This thing just does that, except without the traditional mirror. Up front, you also have some cool lighting. The headlights look fairly normal, but below that, the running lights are neat with these LEDs, and then the front turn signals are like the very tips of these LED running lights, which I think is kind of a neat little touch, a distinctive way to put the turn signals on this car. And again, another cool lighting touch that sort of speaks to the futuristic and neat design language of the XL1. And by the way, since I'm up front, worth noting you can't get into this front panel. The diesel engine and the cargo area are in back. The front panel is fixed in place. There's no like latch you can pop it open. This is just to be opened with like specialized tools at a dealership with a mechanic, not for regular people like you and me to get in here. Probably a bunch of mechanical and electrical stuff under the traditional hood. And next up, I want to go over some general quirks and features of the XL1 because not that many people know very much about this car, and there is not that much stuff on YouTube or anywhere about the XL1s. In fact, most people don't realize that this car was actually put into production, but yes, it was. Volkswagen made about 250 of them and sold around 200 to the actual public. And yes, it cost $150,000. These had a starting price around 111,000 euro, which translates to about $135,000, but of course that was 7 or 8 years ago, so figure about 150 grand in today's money. And yes, it really did get 260 miles per gallon. In fact, I've read some stories of people getting up to 300 miles per gallon if they were really hypermiling and totally trying to maximize their fuel economy. Although I've also heard stories of journalists who turned on the air conditioning, drove the car hard, paid no attention to fuel economy, and they still got 100 miles per gallon out of this thing. That was just the nature of this car. Truly amazing. This would have been a great commuter car. It really would have, getting 100, 200 miles per gallon while you're commuting. Unfortunately, this car really was more of a technical study just to see if Volkswagen could do it. And it came out at the worst time, just a few months before Volkswagen's diesel emission scandal, which of course was a big deal. It took away resources from projects like this, and it gave this car kind of a black eye since it uses a diesel engine. Volkswagen wasn't really keen to continue development of projects like this. Instead, they moved toward electric cars and kind of said goodbye to diesel in general. It really is a shame though, because I think this would be a great commuter. Imagine if all of us who had very powerful, inefficient sports cars drove this to work every day. It would be a pretty cool world if you could get 200 miles per gallon commuting to work in order to offset the 20 miles per gallon you got on the weekends in your fun car. But unfortunately, this is dead, and it appears the electric vehicle is taking over instead. But this was a pretty cool car at this moment in time. And so those are the quirks and features of the very quirky Volkswagen XL1. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Volkswagen XL1. Now I have to tell you, I know I look small in this car, but I don't really feel all that small. I feel like I'm totally at a normal size, sort of. It's a pretty good use of space in this interior. It's a little bit bigger than you might think. I have acceptable headroom. I mean, I feel like driving this car, I'm okay. I wouldn't want to put maybe 2 huge people in here, but it works. All right, first things first, obviously, initially the camera mirrors are a little bit trippy. The McLaren Speedtail I drove also had this, but they were in the exact same place as normal mirrors, and so you didn't really think about it that much, but in this car, it's like lower, and so you gotta kind of think about it. Plus, there's no central rear view mirror, which is a little bit weird. I'm driving the car in sport mode. I'm currently flooring it 80, 84, 90, 100, that's kilometers. It's not exactly the fastest thing in the world. So for $150,000, if you were looking for a supercar, it kind of looks like a supercar, but ultimately it isn't one. But it is really cool. Now, the people at the Lane Motor Museum told me that when they take this out, they get more looks in this than just about any other vehicle that they have. People are stopping to take pictures of it, asking what it is, whatever. It's a very, very strange vehicle. And obviously that's not because these people know the XL1, it's because they're like, what is this thing? Now I gotta tell you, this is kind of a neat little car to zip around in. Like I said, I fit pretty well. And cruising around, it feels like a fairly normal car. And the idea of getting like 200 plus miles per gallon, that is a pretty cool idea, frankly. And driving around in this thing and getting that level of fuel economy, I could see this being a fantastically wonderful commuter car. And I suspect that obviously they only sold 200 of these to the public, and all of them in Europe, but I suspect there are some really loyal owners of this car who are just like insistent that they only commute in this and probably have some big miles on them. I could see this as being a fantastic commuter car if you don't really have to go anywhere that requires a lot of cargo or storage or passengers, that sort of thing. It really would be a neat car to just kind of take to work. And it drives reasonably well from that perspective. I mean, compared to like a Prius, this isn't slow. It feels normal like a Prius. This isn't, you know, tight in here. And it's certainly more interesting, and you're getting this insane mile per gallon. I mean, you feel like you're driving the future in this car, and I feel like that now, even though this car is 7 years old. In terms of the actual driving experience stuff, like I mentioned before, obviously the acceleration is weak. So this car has a dual clutch, which I think is intended to both improve fuel economy and acceleration. Doesn't do much for acceleration. you can hear a lot of what's going on outside you. Obviously, this is kind of a little car. It's not sound deadened and stuff like a luxury car, despite its price point. In fact, I suspect they took a lot of that stuff out to keep weight as low as possible. So you can really hear trucks that go by, road noise, engine noise. It's surprising me how loud the diesel engine is, considering it's a fairly modern vehicle and it's a small engine, but you can really hear it. In terms of handling, the car actually feels pretty zippy. The steering precision isn't great like a sports car like you might expect, but handling the car is actually relatively good. It's reasonably tossable. You can kind of throw it around. There's some body roll, and obviously the tires give you a little pushback. They don't really want you to go crazy. They're just not designed for that. There's not a lot of contact patch on the ground. They're not big tires. They're like aero tires. But they, it works. It's something. It really does feel like a bizarre driving experience in this thing. I mean, it's a totally different world, and it really does feel like the future. Not only are you in this little tiny car, the passenger seat's like behind you, you got the mirrors, but you can just tell everything about it is just kind of weird and interesting. And actually, it's kind of cool driving it around.
And so that's the Volkswagen XL-1. This is a seriously interesting car, a car that was on the very forefront of alternative fuel technology when it came out now almost a decade ago. These are ultra expensive and ultra limited, but it's also a marvel of engineering. And now it's time to give the XL-1 a DOUGSCORE.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the XL-1 isn't traditionally beautiful, but it's striking and cool, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration is slow, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Handling is okay, not amazing. It's not necessarily intended to be a thrilling sports car, but it's spry enough, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Fun factor is high, though, since you're piloting such an interesting and weird vehicle, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and these are seriously cool, though people have to kind of know what it is, and most people don't. It gets a 7 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 24 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It has the basics, but nothing more really, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Comfort is fine, not great but acceptable, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Quality is only okay. The interior is fine, though not amazing, and reliability is probably a big question mark since this was such a low production run. I wouldn't count on part support forever, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is mediocre with 2 seats and only an average sized trunk, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Finally, value, and these were over $100,000 when they're new, and they're still big money for an economy car supercar, which sounds odd because it is odd. It's a lot to spend, though the limited production ensures this car will stay special forever, and it gets a 5 out of 10 for a total daily score of 22 out of 50. Added up, and the DOUGSCORE is 46 out of 100, which places it here, although I have no clue what its rivals are. I chose a few other tiny cars and a few interesting electric cars, but the truth is, the XL-1 is totally one of a kind. Nothing like this has ever really been built before or since, and I'm thrilled I had the chance to experience such a weird and special car.